Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are going back to the summer of 2010 and taking a look at another one of the Frog strategies at the time. We've already profiled Frog FTK, which is in the running for one of the best decks of all time, certainly at this portion of Yu-Gi-Oh!'s history. But today we're going to take a look at Frog Monarch. So March 2010 is an interesting date. Seeing it's out at the very beginning of that format, people typically refer to as Edison format, and Frog Monarchs at least was originally when people started to introduce themselves to that format, a pretty popular deck. It's fallen onto the wayside and people have incorporated frogs in different ways. But Frog Monarch was a deck that at Edison specifically was a deck that you really had to worry about. I'm always going to label the format based on the name of the title, the beginning of a ban list. So I'm going to still label this March 2010. This isn't exactly what a Frog Monarch deck would have looked like at actual Edison, though not too far off. I refer to the entire format based on the name of the actual ban list. This particular deck, though, would have been played during National season after the Shining Darkness came out. The Shining Darkness is going to have a warping effect on the format. A lot of the strategies at Edison go by the wayside, besides maybe Frog Monarchs being the exception, which is actually convenient for today. But the Shining Darkness gives us Dark Soul, so X-Sabers becomes exponentially better than it was before. In addition to that, we have Herald of Perfection release, so we have an entirely new archetype based on Herald of Perfection, Christia, and normal fairy monsters. Of course, we have Infernities, releasing cards like Infernity Launcher and Mirage that make that deck a top-tier deck. And then, of course, we also have decks like Frog Monarchs lying around, in addition to some other fringe strategies like Black Wings. But when you go to the 2010 US Nationals or really any Nationals, you would have to consider Frog Monarchs as a top-tier, more or less anti-meta strategy. This is a deck that has sort of the inherent Frog Monarch package of Swap Frogs, Substitutes, Ronin Tonins, and a single copy of Dupe Frog, so it can still do a dupe lock, not quite to the extent of the Frog FTK deck, where it could go multiple Dupe Frogs with Flip-Flop Frog and Unifrog and basically win the game through controlling. This deck, though, can still set up the traditional dupe lock with Substitute and lock the opponent out if they don't have a way of dealing with it, and then continually tribute summon for Monarchs, right? The deck has Caius and Ryza, your kind of quintessential top-tier Monarchs. But this deck also incorporates Vanity's Fiend, a card that, if you look at the entire format, the sort of traditional decks do not have a lot of outs for. There's very, very, very few outs. So having 3 copies of Vanity's Fiends gives this deck a very particular avenue of winning, where all of a sudden you just drop a Vanity's Fiend and the opponent's sitting there like, wow, okay, so I can use my Dark Soul to search, I don't know, Pashul or an Emmer's Blade, or not, certainly not Emmer's Blade, but Pashul to stall out. Like, if you're playing X-Sabers, you're not able to special summon over the Vanity's Fiend. Eventually you're going to die. If you're playing Frog FTK, you certainly are not going to have a good time. I vividly remember watching my good friend CJ Lack pilot Frog FTK into the top 32 of that Nationals and lose to the Frog Monarch deck at the top because a card like Vanity's Fiend is so difficult to deal with. Yeah, eventually you might be able to set up a Flip-Flop Frog combo, but you're not going to be able to set up the dupe lock under Vanity's Fiend, and you will eventually lose the game. Even Infernities, certainly some of the versions of Infernities had cards like Book of Moon, but by and large, Vanity's Fiend, again, is going to put in a lot of work against that strategy as well. So this is an interesting deck in the sense that it really is an anti-meta deck. It's also a deck that has a quantity of hand traps, right? DD Crow was pretty popular across the board by the national season in 2010, but this deck also gets Cores. This deck also gets Battle Fader. So it has a couple additional hand trap style cards in addition to the DD Crows that differentiate a little bit from the rest of the format. But nevertheless, we're going to take our very first deep dive look at Frog Monarchs, specifically the Frog Monarch deck or something very close to it that topped at the 2010 US Nationals. All right, we're going to start with the Tribute. So this is a deck that's really primarily based on Tribute summoning. We're going to, of course, start with 3 copies of Caius, arguably the best Monarch of all time. And if Caius isn't the best Monarch, then Ryza probably is the best Monarch. The flexibility, being able to hit monsters in back row, is obviously one of the advantages of these over cards like Zaborg and Mobius, even though sometimes those cards can inherently be a little bit better. But we have 3 copies of each Caius and Ryza. This deck, although Frog Monarch actually plays a lot of non-Monarch Tribute monsters, we have 3 copies of Vanity's Fiend. Vanity's Fiend is really difficult for decks to deal with in this format. If it doesn't get hit by Bottomless or Torrential on its original summon, Mirror Force isn't overwhelmingly popular, and then the outs are primarily just main deck copies of Book of Moon, which technically X-Sabers played 2 or 3, technically Infernity sometimes played them, so it is a card that can be outed with some of the main deck options, but there's only 2 or 3 main deck options. There's not a wealth of options, so having a card like Vanity's Fiend can actually just steal games outright. Then we have 2 copies of Light and Darkness Dragon. Technically, the version of this deck that topped the North American World Championship qualifier played 3 of these, but I only have 2 retro pack Light and Darkness Dragons. They're kind of hard to come by. And I elected to cut the card for a bigger utility card, a card that I think actually probably warranted a 3 of anyway. We'll get to that when I get to the spells. Lane Darkness Dragon can be difficult to summon as a double tribute, not necessarily all the time because of how much the Frog Engine plus Soul Exchange and enemy control is there, but I can warrant cutting it down from 3 to 2 because as a double tribute, I don't think it's absolutely essential to win the game, and the double tribute can be a little bit more difficult to facilitate than a single tribute. But we have 2 copies of Light and Darkness Dragon, and then 1 copy of Dark Dust Spirit. This card's really cool. Basically, it's a spirit monster that blows up all face-up monsters on the field, and then as all spirits do, it bounces back into your hand. When you have True Born Frog in the graveyard, you're basically threatening a pseudo board wipe every single turn. And it is, one-sided. It doesn't kill itself when you summon it, so it kills your opponent's face-up monsters and then bounces back to your hand. So Dark Dust Spirit, arguably one of the best cards with Treeborn Frog. And only really a singleton, right? Once you get access to 1, you don't need any more. It's not absolutely essential to win the game, so I can understand only playing a singleton copy so they don't clutter. Past that, we're going to go, I guess, next to the Frogs, because this is a Frog Monarch deck. We have, of course, 3 copies of Substitute and 3 copies of Swap Frog. This is at the exact same time period where Frog FTK was legal, so that's why you see Substitute legal, which is also why, in addition to playing sort of the obvious frogs of Treeborn Frog, Dupe Frog, we have a single copy of Ronin Tonin. Some things to note about the Frog package. This deck can still dupe lock. Sometimes when we play against Frog FTK does the dupe lock with multiple dupes, and the field is just crazy. Dupe, multiple flip-flop frogs, Unifrog. This deck can't quite go that far because it's not playing the full Frog package, but Dupe Frog plus Substitute is still a minor version of the dupe lock and can be really difficult to deal with. So if this deck doesn't have access to Monarchs, it can do that dupe lock and shut the opponent out from really doing much of anything, which is one of the best advantages of this particular deck. Substitute is just an amazing card. You combine it with cards like Treeborn Frog, you combine it with cards like Ronin Tonin, and you just go through your whole deck, slim the deck down, fuel your graveyard up with frogs, trim your deck down so it's mostly Monarchs. It really has always been the case, one of the best cards in this entire deck. Past that, the rest are actually hand traps. So there's 2 versions of hand traps. The first is going to be DD Crow. Why this deck elects to main deck DD Crow is it lines up perfectly with the format. It hits Frog FTK by dealing with Ronin Tonin. If you actually draw both, you can get both Ronin Tonins and just win the game. It's also amazing its Infernities hitting whatever their targets are off launcher. It also lines up pretty well against X-Sabers. It counteracts Gotham's Call, and it's at least playable against Fall Troll. You don't really like to do that. It sort of feels more like you're using Effect Veiler, but it's not the absolute worst thing in the world. And as a result, against all the main decks in the format, DD Crow actually lines up really well. It's also pretty good in the mirror match. Then we have the Battle Stoppers. So this deck, because it doesn't have the traditional trap lineup, relies on cards like Battle Fader and then Gores to not only stop the opponent from just outright killing us, whether that's through an OTK or just in general, but also putting monsters in the field that we can then use to tribute, right? We use Battle Fader, then we bring back Treeborn Frog, and all of a sudden we can go into Light and Darkness Dragon, and we can use the Battle Fader with enemy controller. There's a lot of things that we can do, but Battle Fader has always been a pretty popular inclusion, whether it's this version of the deck from Nationals or the version of the deck that we see at SJC Edison, which is obviously one of the most popular retro formats. But I really like the monster lineup. The monster lineup in this deck, I think, is very clean. It's tribute monsters, frogs, a small little inclusion of the lock, and then hand traps that line up really well with the format, including ones that allow you to survive the battle phase without your traditional traps. But that is our monster lineup. Our spell lineup has a lot of the just generic good Monarch cards. We have 3 Soul Exchange and 3 Enemy Controller. The deck that top Nationals only played 2 copies of Enemy Controller, but Econ is one of my favorite cards in this particular strategy, which is why I cut a Light and Darkness Dragon for 1. The ability to just take your opponent's monster, also have the backdoor of just setting it defensively when you're absolutely desperate, has always been one of the reasons I absolutely love Enemy Controller. Then we have Brain Control, which sort of works within that, so we have 7 ways of taking our opponent's monsters, which is a pretty reasonable amount of the deck. Then we just have back row destruction, MST, Cold Wave, and Heavy Storm. Cold Wave is really good in this deck because it allows you to target things with Caius and Ryza and not have to worry about your opponent chaining it. And then on the following turn, maybe you spun that 1 back row and now you can summon another Monarch and the opponent couldn't set back rows because of Cold Wave. It just lines up really well. It's also it's more or less impossible, not 100% impossible because cards like Mirage are pretty good, but it's really, really difficult for Infernities to kill you after you Cold Wave, especially because they can't set their back rows. So if they have cards in the hand, they can't set them. They basically need to have already set them the previous turn and drawn into maybe just Archfiend off the top, and then maybe they can find a way of killing you, but it's basically impossible to realistically die. So Cold Wave just lines up really well against Infernities by guaranteeing that you don't die, which sometimes is all that you need to then tribute someone for a Vanity's Fiend and lock them out of the game. The trap lineup's really simple. We have 2 copies of Regeki Break. I can understand playing 2 copies of Wing Blast. Wing Blast lines up a little bit better against set monsters and X-Sabers in case it's Dark Soul. It also lines up really well with just having Ryza in your deck. So the deck that topped Nationals played Regeki Break. I've always preferred Wing Blast over Regeki Break, but that's a little bit of a personal preference question. But that is our main deck. In terms of the extra deck, so this deck doesn't have any tuners in whether it's the main deck or the side deck. As a result, the only realistic way that we are going into the extra deck is through enemy controller, and having 3 copies makes it reasonable, plus brain. And then this deck actually plays Gotham's Emergency Call, because that card typically lines up really well against X-Sabers, as we'll talk about momentarily. As a result, we do have an extra deck. First card we have here is Armory Arm. It's very difficult to summon Armory Arm, right? You basically need to take control of a level 1. Your opponent needs to have like Effect Veiler on the field for some reason, and then you take something with Gotham's Emergency Call or Brain. It's highly unlikely, but I can understand this deck basically just having as many options as possible, because you're not really going to go into the extra deck. A couple level 5s. You actually could theoretically do this. In Sabers, you could take their Pashul, and then whether it's with Pashul and Emmer's Blade, or Pashul and another X-Saber like Dark Soul, if you absolutely positively needed to, you could facilitate something there. I guess with Armory Arm, now that I'm thinking about it, a few of these decks played Rajagura as an X-Saber, which isn't super popular in later versions of X-Sabers, but was popular here or there in this version of X-Sabers. So you actually technically could take that as a level 1 and then a level 3 tuner. So Armory Arm actually is a little bit easier to make than maybe I claimed a moment ago. But 2 level 5s if you take a level 2 tuner and a level 3 tuner, or a level 3 non-tuner rather. In terms of level 6s, we actually are going to play Bryonak because it's just basically the best one of all time. We have Goyo Guardian, where if Bryonak's not the best, it's probably Goyo Guardian. An interesting one is just an actual High Unlay in this deck, which might seem out of place. But if we're playing Gotham's Emergency Call, we actually can summon High Unlay against X-Sabers, which can be pretty amazing. From there, we go into the level 7s. We have Black Rose Dragon and Herbellum. For the level 8s, we have Thought Ruler Archfiend, Colossal Fighter, Stardust Dragon, and Red Dragon Archfiend. Again, it's incredibly unlikely that we would need these, but we have Brain and Enemy Controller plus Gotham's Emergency Call. It's not impossible. We also have a play where, let's just say for the sake of discussion, you DD Crow their Fultril target, and maybe they just leave Fultril on the field, and then you enemy control their Fultril, and you Gotham's Emergency Call their Pashul back. It's not impossible to go into level 8, so you might as well have the options. In terms of level 9s, we have a Mistworm and a Gotham's, and just X-Saber Gotham's, and then a Chimera Tech. I probably would just play more Chimera Techs, even though this deck doesn't have Cyber Dragon in it, just because you never know. But here's a pretty reasonable extra deck, considering the fact that the only way we're going into it is with our opponent's monsters. In terms of the decks at the time, we had X-Sabers, which won Nationals. Shout out to Sean Montague. We have, of course, Infernity, which was the other boogeyman in the room. We have Herald of Perfection decks, which were okay. It's actually the deck that I played at SJC Indianapolis that year. I thought it lined up really well against some of these strategies, but wasn't overwhelmingly popular, really annoying to play against them. We had Frog Monarchs, like the deck that we just profiled. We had Frog FTK, which is probably the best deck in the format. And then some sort of secondary tier decks. Some people still played Caliber Cat. I don't really know why. Technically, one did top 16 nationals, so I will give credit to it. Black Wings, some people still considered it a good anti-meta choice. I don't, but it was still there. Gladiator Beasts. Dan LaMartina actually went to nationals and took Gladiator Beast into the top 4, and as a result ended up going to Worlds with Gladiator Beasts. I also remember Adam Korn top 32ing with Gladiator Beast, so it had a few slots in the top 32. It's just one of those decks that just generally speaking lines up pretty well when you have such a robust trap lineup. Cards like Cherry can be tough to deal with, so there's Gladiator Beasts. And then I really don't think Gadgets are very good, but technically people still played them. This is the top 32 Frog Monarch extra deck, so it's our side deck. It's kind of an interesting side deck in retrospect. One of the main reasons I elected to profile this one is I think the side deck's actually pretty cool. It has a lot of really narrow but incredibly powerful cards, and I think it's an interesting take on a side deck. So we have 3 copies of Gold lining up really well against X-Saber strategies, where if they hit you with Airbellum or Gotham's, and Gotham's is a little bit more popular than you might think. Summoning Gotham's is very common in X-Sabers in this format. You can just summon Gold and pop 2 cards, which is pretty fantastic, right? It totally just almost invalidates the X-Saber effect. We have 3 copies of Consecrated Light, which lines up against Infernities. So far we have 6 cards that are unbelievably narrow, only for one particular deck in the format, which is pretty interesting. We have a copy of Burial, so that if our opponent gets rid of our Treeborn Frogs, we can put them back. Right, you only have 2 Treeborn Frogs, so it does allow you to bring them back if the opponent hits us with double DD Crow, or if the opponent is playing Crevice. That's something to actually note in this deck. You don't necessarily always want to just put Frogs in the graveyard for no reason, particularly the extra Treeborn Frog, because it could hit by Crevice. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but we have Burial in case we do lose our Treeborn, and then worst case, we can refuel our Ronintonans again. Then we have a couple copies of Dust Tornado, which is just, just generic back row removal. The Infernity deck sometimes sided into this really robust trap deck, so sometimes having access to a Dust Tornado wouldn't be a bad idea. A couple copies of Crevice. I really liked Crevice in this format. Basically, you just banish 2 cards with the same attribute, in the opponent's graveyard. And what that does is it can totally stymie the frog player because it can hit hopefully both Ronintones and the game is just over, but it's unlikely your opponent would play into that. They'd probably Unifrog you first if they're playing the FDK. But nevertheless, you can still hit other cards like the frogs in the deck. In the mirror match, it's really great. Against Infernities, it's absolutely unbelievable. It's just one of those cards that lines up really well in the format. It's one of the reasons why you have to be a little bit careful to play your Treatment Frogs into the graveyard for no reason. Like, yes, sometimes you want to just use a Swap Frog and get some incremental advantage, but sometimes it's better to send a Swap Frog so you have a Treatment Frog in the deck in case your opponent has Crevice and they can't just hit both your Treebones. Then we have a couple copies of Divine Wrath. It's just an interesting card in the sense that a Counter Trap is obviously a really powerful effect. You have cards that you want to discard like Treebone Frog and even some of the other frogs like Ronintonen and then just any frog to fuel Ronintonen. And then honestly, even Swap Frog is not the greatest thing in the world. Yes, I know you can bounce Monarchs with Swap Frog. It has some utility, but you have cards in your hand that you could reasonably discard, and it can just be a really difficult card to play around. There's really no playing around it in some sense. Then we have, as I alluded to earlier, two incredibly narrow side deck slots, but we have double Godam's Emergency Call. What's really cool about Godam's Emergency Call is you do not need to actually own the X-Saber to trigger this. There just needs to be an X-Saber on the field. So sometimes in decks that didn't play any X-Sabers, you would see people side deck copies of this because you can just activate this when your opponent has an X-Saber and special 2 X-Sabers from their graveyard. One that can play around Godam's, because if your opponent activates Godam, by virtue of their activation, they have already satisfied the effect of having an X-Saber on the field. So then you can activate this in response and then take their targets or take one of their targets and something else if you need to. You can technically do this against Fall Troll if they don't have a Godam set, so you can take their Fall Troll target. Kind of depends on exactly what they target. This card is really annoying to play against as an X-Saber player, but an amazing card in some decks like this one where what's cool about this deck, in my opinion, is that the side deck is so incredibly narrow in how it's siding. Some of these are just absolute blowouts. Gold could end the game. Crevice can end the game. Consecrated Light is an interesting one in the sense that depending on how they side deck, it could end the game. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily always do that, but then Godam's Emergency Call can just end the game out of nowhere. So to me, a really cool looking side deck. But nevertheless, that's Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.